Welcome back to the Lunch Bunch Kindie Keeners. Today we're going to read Chapter 15, March, Cold Case Crime Club. LB6 continued on with their Saturday visits to the library. At the first Sneaky Spy Saturday in March, Brandon slapped the new mystery notes on Mrs. Dewberry's desk. Note number 1, do you like mystery and adventure? And you forgot the question mark, announced Francis 001. Agent 002, Matthew continued, why don't you join our club? And you forgot another question mark and the apostrophe. I have no clue what that is, but Francis told me to say it. Note number 3, we call ourselves the Cold Case Crime Club, or CCCC for short, shared Pooja 003. Finally, Brandon chimed in. The last note said, I hope you get to meet Detective Callahan. Easy peasy, lemon squeezy. We all worked on decoding and found your backwards code only a little tricky at first, explained Ashley. Then, once we solved the first one, we were on our way, raved Andrew. Well done, agents, praised Mrs. Dewberry. As promised, she moved right into a conversation to describe a cold case that the agents might be interested in. As a special surprise, I invited Detective Callahan, Leroy, and a couple of members of the Cold Case Crime Club to tell you about the unsolved Mountain Creek Museum heist. Please welcome Detective Callahan and Mr. and Mrs. Patrick, kids, said Mrs. Dewberry. Why, Leroy? Whispered Andrew to Brandon. Brandon shrugged. Ashley took a look at the detective and said under her breath, my grandpa would describe you as a tall drink of water. Detective Callahan smiled and replied, I have been called worse. I've been a police officer for over 20 years and a detective for 10 of those. I do enjoy solving crime and helping people who make poor choices correct their behavior. Matthew's mouth got a little dry and his eyes bugged out. Poor choices. What has he heard about me? He asked Andrew. Andrew, Brandon, and Ashley looked at Matthew with wide eyes. Mrs. Dewberry continued, Mr. and Mrs. Patrick are relatives of the family who lost their precious items 3 years ago when the museum was robbed in broad daylight. I invited Leroy to join the club because he has a keen interest in mysteries. Welcome to the club, Lunch Bunch. Mrs. Dewberry has told me all about you. I look forward to working with all of you, said the detective. At our last CCCC meeting, we thought LB6 would be most interested in this case. Mrs. Dewberry handed Francis a newspaper article dated May 14th, 1994. I'll read this out loud, if I may, Francis said as she cleared her throat and began. Brazen daylight robbery in Mountain Creek. On May 13th, 1994, 2 very valuable artifacts were stolen from an exhibit at the Mountain Creek Museum. The Patrick family wanted the community to have a chance to see the family's antique artifacts that traveled to Canada from Germany over 100 years ago. The details are sketchy, but it seems that 2 pieces of the valuable jewelry collection were taken over the lunch hour. Missing is a gold star with 5 precious gems, 1 in each arm of the star. As well, missing is a small gold coffee spoon with a diamond in the handle. If you have any information about the incident, please contact Detective Callahan at the Mountain Creek Police Department. Detective Callahan continued to explain further. Just about 3 years ago, the robbery occurred. The call to the police department came in after 1 o'clock when the curator returned from an appointment and noticed the items missing. Can we ask questions as we go along? Asked Andrew. Oh, yes, please do, replied Detective Callahan. What does curator mean? Asked Andrew. Mrs. Dewberry jumped in. A curator is the person at the museum who gathers old historical pieces, learns about them to tell visitors the story behind them, and looks after them. The curator of Mountain Creek Museum is Olive Periwinkle. She has been with the museum for many years. Moving on, said the detective, it could have happened at least 2 hours prior to the call. Olive left the museum at 11 o'clock a.m. to attend an appointment. That meant the culprits were ahead of the police by at least a couple of hours. The PD immediately closed both roads out of town and stopped every vehicle and did a thorough search. Nothing turned up at the time. A year later, the star without the gems turned up in a northern Alberta pawn shop. The owner of the Pawn Palace in Sherwood Park did not keep a record of the person who pawned it. Wait, what is a pawn palace? Asked Matthew. Again, Mrs. Dewberry interjected. A pawn shop is a place where you can sell items and get cash for them. Continue, please. So, the lead went dead? Asked Leroy. Correct, Leroy. There were no gems left in the star. So far, we believe that to mean the thieves were traveling north when they left Mountain Creek. What did the gems look like, Mr. Patrick? Asked Matthew. Mr. Patrick answered, good question. The local police printed off posters with pictures of what the gems looked like. We circulated hundreds of the posters all over Alberta. Detective Callahan, are there any posters left in the file that we can give to the lunch bunch? The detective thumbed through the file and found a couple of posters and handed them over to Matthew. Mr. Patrick began explaining again. My father was sickened with worry when someone robbed the exhibit at the museum. His intention of displaying the old artifacts was purely to share something old with anybody who is interested in antiques. My wife and I joined the Cold Case Crime Club to help with the case, but also cold cases intrigue us. Detective Callahan looked at his watch and announced he was late for a meeting. Thank you for your interest, Lunch Bunch. We will talk soon, I hope. The Lunch Bunch talked through the case a little bit more with the adults, and when they left the meeting, they had a few minutes of private time to talk as a team. The questions came fast and furious. Matthew stared at the gem posters. Mates, don't these three look like the jewels we found? Let me have a look, said Brandon. Which ones, Matthew? Matthew pointed them out to Brandon. Ashley moved in to have a look. It's them. I know it, she confirmed. Matthew convinced LB6 the jewels they found were connected to the robbery. Let's hang the posters in HQ on the bulletin board, suggested Matthew. It is our most important case. Andrew changed the subject. Why did they give us the jewel case instead of the first one? Maybe Mrs. Dewberry is in on it. What about Mr. and Mrs. Patrick? Could they have something to do with it, wondered Pooja. Francis asked, how does Leroy fit in? He led us straight to the gems. Hang on a minute, Francis. Leroy led us straight to HQ. He might know nothing about the hidden gems, suggested Andrew. Brandon suggested that whoever hid the first 3 jewels probably hid the remaining 2. If the thieves were in a hurry, they would probably hide them close to where the first 3 were found. That means the missing 2 gems could be somewhere in HQ, or even in the walkway, Ashley finished. Brandon added, it would have taken a bit of time to fill in the framing with ladder steps, so there wouldn't have been much time to go to another location to hide the gems. I bet they're at the school, chimed in Andrew. Francis called, circle agents. We have to get back to HQ. Let's ask for a Thursday after-school play date. Hands in, the spy team chanted. LB6.